We will never turn our back on a single Scot.
We've got to wrestle with those challenges.
This is our country. Let's fix it together.
It's the same nonsense we've heard time and time again.
Hello and welcome to the final Planet Holyrood this year. It's our end of year review covering 2024. I'm Paul Hutcheon, political editor of the Daily Record, and I'm joined by two illustrious colleagues.
Where?
Yes, indeed. We've got Douglas Dickie of the Scottish Daily Express, and we've got Hannah Rodger, who's the chief reporter with the Sunday Mail. So we've got left and right well represented. Obviously, I'm impartial and objective.
Of course.
Although I was described as a centrist dad last week, which was a wounding blow. I think I might struggle to get over that.
I'm sure you'll kill me for saying this, but do you remember the time we worked together and someone described you as a right-wing voice?
Yeah, I remember that as well. Never spoken to that person since.
No.
I think he mentioned it in the editorial conference as well, which
yeah, in
was
front of everyone.
Absolutely gutting.
Yeah, your face was a picture.
Yes, no, I
I
remember
wasn't
it.
here, by the way.
I remember it
elsewhere.
very well. It was a horrible moment. So 2024, I think I would split it into two halves. You've got up until the general election, which was July the 4th, and then you've got from July 4th to where we are just now. So if you look at the first 6 months, they were terrible for the SNP and the SNP government. You had the whole trauma of Humza's short-lived, ill-fated spell as First Minister coming to a close through his cack-handed sort of termination of the agreement with the Greens. You had the Michael Matheson scandal just rumbling on and on until he finally got suspended. And then at the same time you had the rise of Labour across the UK and in Scotland as well, them doing really well in the polls, all culminating in that incredible general election result where I think Labour ended up with 37 seats in Scotland and the SNP fell to below 10. Not quite a wipeout, but it was a bit of a massacre. So, you know, if the year had ended on July the 4th, people would be saying it was awful for the Scottish National Party and it was a brilliant year for Anas Sarwar.
Yeah, they would, but unfortunately for Anas Sarwar, we had another 6 months to go, which happened to be the first 6 months of the Labour government, which, you know, I think when Labour won the general election so spectacularly, everyone said, well, this could be a really good thing for Anas, or it could be bad, depending on how well Labour does in government. And I think, unfortunately, we're seeing now that things aren't maybe going so well for Labour. There's obviously a few high-profile sort of policies that they've had to not U-turn on, but, you know, for example, even yesterday, the WASPy stuff, the winter fuel allowance, all these things that are making them kind of deeply unpopular with people, and that is, you know, sadly going to have a knock-on impact for Anas when it comes to the Holyrood elections. Did
you feel, like Dougie, like July the 4th, I just felt like the tectonic plates of Scottish politics had shifted. You know, we had over a decade of SNP dominance, winning elections so easily, and then it all seemed to have changed at that general election. People felt like the SNP were in retreat, that Anas Sarwar was a shoo-in to be First Minister. The SNP were on their way out. I mean, they may still lose 2026, but it just feels like in December, things have changed dramatically compared to July.
Yeah, but I don't think that's necessarily because the SNP have had a much better July through to December. I think it's because, you know, Sir Keir Starmer, for whatever reason, has decided that he, you know, you've said it before, Paul, he's kind of front-loading bad news on people. They've got this massive majority. Labour are pretty much untouchable at Westminster. They probably think if they use the next year or two to get, you know, some really unpopular policies out there, it still gives them plenty of time to turn things round UK-wide. That doesn't do Anas Sarwar any good at all. If anything, it's, you know, hang him out to dry a bit. But when you look at, you know, the polling, I know we had one a few weeks ago, which was quite dramatic, but, you know, one out of how many? You know, it's not like the SNP vote's recovering. You know, it's that the Labour vote is going elsewhere. And the other big story, you know, it's still early days in it, is obviously this rise of reform in the last 4 months, at least in the polls, and certainly in by-elections as well, where they're performing well. And this kind of disconnect between people, you know, and the established Westminster parties, and even, you know, the SNP as well. I think 2024 is a year, from an SNP point of view, where their real sole policy, you know, came to an end. We're 10 years now minimum from another independence referendum. It's off the table. The Constitution is not a factor for the vast majority of Scots, even those who might be inclined to back independence, and that hasn't changed since July the 4th. The difference is obviously right now Labour are just piling on the misery, or seemingly kind of, you know, piling on the misery. But when you look back in that, you know, that was the moment of the year, I suppose, for some people was sitting there watching ITV, Nicola Sturgeon's face as the results were coming in. You know, we all remember it. £25,000 well spent, I think we'd all agree. And to imagine where we are now, I think was pretty much unthinkable. I think a lot of people thought there's no way Labour can do as badly as things had been going for the Tories beforehand. The greatest irony maybe is Rishi Sunak had probably steadied the ship a bit up until that election. You know, maybe if he had waited.
Really?
I think he had, yeah. I think
It's full of holes.
Sorry?
The ship was full of holes. It was going to
Do
the
you remember
seabed.
I mean, that campaign was one of the worst ever campaigns.
I think because of when he called it was a complete, you know, it
You
was
sang
a
there in the
massive
fishing
mistake.
game
I think if
with no
if
umbrella.
he'd waited, it might have been a different result.
Yeah.
But look, we are where we are. Labour have had a dreadful few months. Let's be honest, all of it self-inflicted. But I think UK-wide, there's still plenty of time to turn that round. Holyrood-wise, you know, it doesn't look good for Anas.
I feel like one of the turning points this year was the resignation of Humza Yousaf. Because up until that point, you know, everything that was happening to the SNP was bad. They were on edge about Operation Branchform. Matheson was in full swing. You had lots of splits and rows with the Greens. That was creating internal tensions. And when Humza resigns, although it probably felt like another terrible moment for the SNP at the time, I just feel like that has helped them move on. They now lead a minority government with a better leader who has steadied the ship. You know, he's focusing on...
Better leader?
Yeah, I think Swinney...
In what sense?
Well, I just feel like Humza was never suited to leadership. I think if you look at his...
But why?
He's far
I
too
feel like
thin-skinned for a start. He's far too thin-skinned. He took
I feel
criticism
like
to heart.
he was kind of set up a bit, to be honest, Humza.
Well, he had a really bad inheritance, but I think he made things just a lot worse for himself.
Well, potentially, but I think he was also being advised by people who maybe had different agendas than, you know, supporting him in his position.
Yeah, but then, you know, advice is one thing. You don't have to take the advice. If you compare, like, Humza's budget to John Swinney's budget, Humza makes a big song and dance about how he's committed to child poverty and reducing it. He comes in, has the council tax freeze, cuts the affordable housing budget. Swinney's budget, by common consent, was a much shrewder budget politically. I just think that...
Yeah, but for somebody who literally has said, oh, my number one priority is, you know, reducing child poverty or eliminating child poverty, the budget does basically nothing for that.
No, I would accept that, but I think the affordable housing cuts, reversing those, that's definitely a step in the right direction. The winter fuel payments, I mean, okay, giving £100 to millionaires is not a great move, but folk on 12, 13 grand are going to get that payment as well. I just feel like maybe Swinney has learned from his traumatic first spell in charge of the leadership. He just seems to have a much more united group behind him. Also a smaller Westminster group as well, which is helpful given how split the Westminster group was under Humza and under Nicola. Things are just falling into line for Swinney in a way that it just didn't for his predecessor.
I don't know if I would agree with that, though. Like, I don't... You know, I think when the turmoil of, you know, Nicola Sturgeon stepping down, the party, obviously you had which we'll talk about later, but obviously Alex Salmond kind of agitating from the sidelines, and the party was very split. So Humza's taking over a party where, you know, there are huge divisions and people seem to be kind of in one camp or the other. And then, you know, John Swinney comes in after Humza's sort of been made to do all this sort of dirty work, and then he leaves. John Swinney comes in, and yes, okay, I think some of the MSPs and MPs have realised that, you know, fighting amongst themselves publicly is not the way to go. But if you scratch the surface, for example, Stephen Flynn, when Stephen Flynn said he was going to stand for Holyrood, you know, instantly there was people publicly and privately saying how much of a disgrace it was, briefing against him, you know. So I just feel like the tension is still there. It's not in any way like it was a united party under Sturgeon, for example.
So if you take like two of the things that have happened on Swinney's watch, you've got the Neil Gray ministerial car row. And
The football thing.
Yeah, the football thing. And then the other thing that you just mentioned there. I feel like Swinney has managed to close down these things quicker than Humza was able to. It wasn't overnight, but they're pretty much done and dusted. They haven't rumbled on in the same way that they would have done under Humza.
I don't think that's necessarily a good thing, because, you know, if you look at those two people, they're still in their positions. Okay, Stephen Flynn decided, oh, I've maybe made a mistake, but there's not really been any, you know, any comeuppance for one of them.
Oh, no, I mean, you know, in terms of like,
just
you know,
wants
justice for the taxpayer, yeah, but if you're looking at it from the perspective of SNP unity and what is good for Swinney, I just think he's been a better leader than Humza, although I think that's a pretty low bar.
I don't know if you can say it's a better leader just by getting people to shut up faster, but not actually dealing with the problem.
Well, I think you have to close down and deal with things that are causing your administration bother. And Humza was just completely unable to do that.
One of the big advantages Swinney's got over Humza is his two, you know, Humza had this spectre of Kate Forbes kind of hanging over him the whole time. This person who was seen as much more competent, a much better bet realistically going forward, a much better politician. I mean Humza Yousaf.
Really?
Well, I think that was, you know, the public's perception of her, and she was obviously seen as potentially the next leader. And you've got Stephen Flynn, whose profile has you know, exploded in the 12-month up until July the 4th. He said himself he's an ambitious guy. They were kind of already the next leader in waiting with Humza, whereas under Swinney immediately brought Kate Forbes into government. So that's her wings
I do think
clipped.
Humza made a mistake not bringing her in.
And he said as much
Flynn,
as well.
And actually, from John Swinney's point of view, as you know, his position as SNP leader, maybe the general election was the best thing that could have happened to him, because Stephen Flynn is right away a greatly reduced figure. He's then reduced himself even more in the eyes of certain party members with a rather candid attempt, you know, at double jobbing. But I mean, I've got to be honest, Hannah, I don't think there's any doubt that John Swinney's a better politician than Humza Yousaf. I really, I don't think that would be difficult, because I don't think Humza Yousaf's a very good politician. What I will say is,
Just say what you really think.
well, I think he's hopeless, to be honest. I think he's useless. What I will say is, in the final kind of 6 months,
I was trying to be gentle, but on you go.
In the final 6 months of his tenure, I had real sympathy for him, considering the situation elsewhere in the world and his family connection with it. I think he get distracted by that. I think he did take his eye off the ball. Completely understandable. I don't have an issue with that from a personal point of view. You know, he's got family members in Gaza. What they must be going through is horrific. But I mean, it's not. Even though that support might not have gone back to the SNP, it's now stopped hemorrhaging in support the way that it was under Humza Yousaf. Now, whether that's just hit its base or whether that's because Swinney's come in and steadied the ship, I guess time will tell. But the fact is, the SNP, you know, the polls for them were only going in one direction under Humza. That stopped under John Swinney.
I still don't think it's fair to say he's a useless politician, very bad politician.
I think he's got some skills. I just don't think he's as
back.
skilled as Swinney. I suppose that's my point.
Well, that's your opinion.
I don't even think
I think
Humza.
the Kate
hard
Forbes
to say he's useless.
The Kate Forbes, that's a good point, because Humza said that he made a mistake not bringing her in. He allowed a situation where he offered her a job that he knew she was going to.
What was the job he offered?
Rural affairs.
Oh, no.
So, he knew she was going to say no to that. He effectively had all of his critics on the back benches rather than in government being part of the team. Swinney's always, I think, been about group unity and party unity, party management, and he's done that well. Whether it's enough to lead him to victory in 2026, I'm not sure, but...
So basically what he needs to do now, right, is the next cabinet reshuffle, he needs to bring Fergus Ewing in as, I don't know, finance minister or something.
Well, I mean, I think he's already got his critics round the table, or people who might be critical
There's
of
always space for more.
I mean, would Fergus want another go? I mean...
Of course, yeah.
I don't know if we overstate the
I'm
influence
all
of
for
Fergus
big
Ewing
tents,
a wee
but I'm
bit
not,
as
I'm not
well.
sure
I
they're that
mean,
big.
Well, we'll get on to that later.
Yeah,
Anyway.
I mean, he's not going to be a future party leader. Kate Forbes might be. Fergus Ewing is never going to lead the SNP. So having him
Say
out.
never.
Well, you know what? Stranger things have happened, I suppose.
Yeah.
See, if you're Anas Sarwar, so you go back to July 4th, an amazing result for him. He's getting all these plaudits. You're going to be the next First Minister. Now the opinion polls are telling a very different story, where they're only going to be picking up a few seats. I mean, what do you? Because the thing with Anas's strategy was that it was about alignment rather than autonomy. It was about being close to Starmer. And as UK Labour went up in the opinion polls, so did Scottish Labour.
Yeah.
It wasn't about a break from UK Labour. But the problem with that strategy is that when UK Labour goes down, then so does Scottish Labour, and that's what's happening.
Yeah, well, especially if you're so kind of closely aligning yourself with Westminster government and they're making all these decisions which are exceedingly unpopular, it then becomes very difficult for you to say, well, I now don't support you when you've been supporting this person or this group for, however long. I mean, I did find it very, very bizarre. I think it was your story, Paul, about the winter fuel payment and how, was it winter fuel?
Is this about...
Sarwar said if he won the Holyrood election, he would reverse the winter fuel. I mean, that is just bizarre when you've got somebody... I mean, it was interesting from a political point of view because it's kind of the first proper, stand that he seems to be taking against Westminster, against the UK Labour Party. But when you've got a Scottish leader having to come out and say that, it just seems crazy. So yeah, I agree. I think they wanted to kind of ride on the coattails when things were going good, but now, they might be regretting that a bit.
Labour's biggest problem, and I said this frequently in the lead up to the election, is that people were turning to them because of who they weren't rather than who they were. And now all of a sudden, who they are is a party who has cut winter fuel payments, who's not going to pay the waspy women after pretty much nailing their colours to the mast on that. I mean, that could be a Lib Dem tuition fee moment. The other one with the farmers taxing maybe a bit more complex, but people are now seeing they now need to stand by what they are. It's not enough to just say, well, change. We need change. We need. Well, yeah, exactly. Yeah. Although, I'm pretty sure that'll be gone by, or there'll be moves to get rid of it by the spring. But all of a sudden, people are getting to look under the bonnet, which we weren't really in the lead up to the election. It was all very light on detail. People are looking under the bonnet and all of a sudden think, hold on a second here. And Anas Sarwar, as you say, is getting, he's tied himself to that ship. And as that ship goes down, I mean, it's still very early days in this Labour government.
Yeah.
There's loads of time, for things to change, again, Westminster-wise, even Holyrood-wise. But
there is
all of a sudden they're having to defend their own record rather than just constantly bash someone else's record. I also wonder if a bit of them might think, it's maybe not the worst thing in the world if the SNP win the Holyrood election, just not with a majority. It might, keeps kind of Labour out the firing line for a while there and lets them kind of focus on UK-wide issues. Anas Sarwar wants to be First Minister. I'm not entirely convinced it's very high on Keir Starmer's.
Steer Carmer?
We'll definitely edit that bit.
Yeah.
I don't think it's very high in Keir Starmer's priority list.
I feel like, you know, heading into 2025, John Swinney is largely in charge of his own political destiny. He leads a government. He's got this massive budget, so you can do good things and get the credit for them, or he can do bad things and he'll get criticism. So I think that, you know, he'll probably think, well, it's down to me. You know, the result is going to be based on largely my decisions. Whereas Anas, I just don't feel like Anas Sarwar at this stage. He is the master of his own destiny. He's looking
he's
over his
not.
shoulder. He's waiting for the UK government to be successful. So far, it hasn't been.
Well, their big sort of, Scottish policy, I guess, is the GB energy thing, which, yes, it's going to be based in Aberdeen, but the chief executive will not be based in Aberdeen, from what I understand. Seems all a bit strange. And, you know, they kind of had the big announcement when, you know, really we all knew that it was going to be based in Aberdeen. But then I feel like there's not been so much about it. You know, if I worked for, like, the Scotland office, for example, comms team, I would be saying, right, we need to be promoting this, like, more often, giving more details, because that announcement, it's just sort of dwindled away. Like, we're not talking about it anymore. We're not, you know, wondering when we're gonna start to see the benefits of these things. And it's almost like it's been forgotten about. So that one, you know, great kind of policy idea that Anas actually could use to his benefit, I think they've just wasted it. And instead, yeah, as you say, he's just sort of looking behind his shoulder all the time, wondering, right, what's coming next. He isn't really in control of, you know, his political destiny.
Good phrase. Just go, you mentioned reform as well, Dougie. The opinion poll showing they're going to win over 2 seats. I mean, first past the post is crucial in 2026. If Labour want to topple the SNP, they need to win those first past the post seats. And yet, if you look at the polls, there's now a 4-way split on the pro-UK side: Tories, Labour, Lib Dems and Reform. It's very hard to win seats when you've got like 4 versus 2, 2 being the SNP and the Greens.
Especially because by-elections suggest that
2.5.
by-elections suggest that Reform aren't just making inroads in traditional Tory areas. In fact, they're actually performing better in these by-elections in the Central Belt in Glasgow. These places where Labour need to win the Central Belt, where there's loads of seats up for grabs. So Reform has been painted as a Tory problem, but it's not just. I mean, it is a massive Tory problem. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah, but it's a Labour problem too.
You know, it's a Labour problem as well, and it's always been an issue for the Unionist parties. Well, the Constitution was kind of all that mattered, and it did feel that way for 10 years. You know, you had that 3 split. I wouldn't even say you had a 2 split. The Scottish Green vote was so meagre in the constituencies that it doesn't really, you know, barely even registers. That might cause the SNP some problems, especially in places like Glasgow, if the Green vote increases. Ironically, it's the Greens that Reform look like taking seats off because of the way the list system works, and it'll be the Greens that get knocked off. It's really... I don't think Reform... I mean, as things stand, Reform are going to be the 4th biggest party at Holyrood, which, if you'd said that
Doubt it.
a year ago... Listen, I've always said the sanctity of the ballot box. It's one thing to say something to someone in Poland.
Yeah.
It's another thing when push comes to shove and you're voting for a government, or in some cases, tactically to stop another party forming a government. But the Reform vote at the general election is far bigger than I thought it would be. I thought a lot of these guys would kind of go back to the Tories, especially when it was given the opportunity to get rid of the SNP. But we've seen it in the North East. Douglas Ross lost his seat because of Reform votes. If Reform hadn't stood there, there's no doubt at all Douglas Ross would have won his seat. It'd have been another body nose for the SNP. Now,
Really, you think it was only Reform?
Yeah,
Not the fact that he
absolutely.
tried to,
Well,
steal his colleague's job.
by that I mean it was Reform people going to Reform.
Yeah,
If those
okay.
Reform people hadn't been there, then I think Douglas Ross would have won the seat, because even, you know, what he'd done obviously was
Shameful.
really unpopular. Yeah, well, you know what, it was extremely unpopular. And but I think a lot of these people again might have said, well, you know what, better to have shameful Douglas Ross than some Nat going down there to, you know, kind of agitate for the breakup of the UK. So
A lot of people had bad campaigns. Douglas Ross had this the worst.
Yeah, we should have maybe had like a top 10
Yeah,
bogus campaigns.
the political Razzies.
Yeah.
And I think that might have been, you know, even Stephen Flynn's double jobbing attempt. I don't think.
He's like, I think Douglas Ross is the Mourinho of terrible political campaigns. It's just
Was that some sort of football?
yeah. Sorry, he was a football manager. Yes,
Yeah.
Unprecedentedly bad. I mean,
It was an
laughably
unbelievable. I mean, we couldn't gobsmacked when that kind of came out. It was just such a bizarre thing to do.
Nasty business.
Yeah, so another major event was the untimely death of Alex Salmond, Scotland's former First Minister and former SNP leader. There's been so much written about this. I think all of us have written plenty about Salmond. I guess my take, for what it's worth, is a brilliant politician, not so brilliant man.
Yeah.
I also think as well, kind of yesterday's man, yesterday's politician. I think that sometimes gets
Well,
forgotten.
I think maybe, but desperately trying to make himself today's
Yeah.
politician. You know, I think that as much as, I mean, let's face it, right? The Alba Party, one of the only reasons why they got any coverage in the news, papers, media, etc., is because Alex Salmond was you know, the leader. If he wasn't around, you know, we just wouldn't. It would be irrelevant, especially at the beginning when they had no elected members at all. We had no obligation to cover anything that they were doing, really, because they didn't have an influence on Scottish political life.
Do they now? Do they have an influence now?
Well, that's that's another discussion. But anyway, I think Salmond obviously, desperately wanted to sort of return to frontline politics and return, maybe, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think he had anything else in his life. Politics was
No, it was
everything for him.
his thing.
That was it.
Yeah.
And I don't blame him for wanting to get back. But, you're right. The only reason they got in the papers was because of him.
Yeah.
But I think he also stopped them from becoming successful because he had a terrible poll rating. He was not just a divisive figure, but I mean, I remember I interviewed him in the run-up to the last Holyrood election, and I said, why do you think your poll rating is so bad? And it's just like, well, when you're in the papers constantly next to things like sexual harassment claims, is inevitably going to hit your reputation, and he never quite got over that. So he was their biggest strength and also their biggest liability, I think. But, I mean...
But I think the problem is as well with Alba is they couldn't see that because everyone who is in that party, or at least at the beginning, the core group who kind of left SNP to join him, they were, like, I would say infatuated with him. They worshipped him and they would never...
Cults, maybe?
Well, yeah, like the cult of Nicola Sturgeon, you also had the cult of Alex Salmond. And I don't think any one of them would say, do you know what, I actually think he's damaging our prospects and hindering us, because none of them believed that. None of them, believed that he could do anything wrong. And so they wouldn't see the damage that potentially his reputation or perceived reputation was having on, the party's prospects.
He was certainly a Marmite figure, with voters and political opponents and friends. But Paul, you're saying that he was their greatest weakness, but I mean, for a start, Alba wouldn't exist without Alex Salmond.
Yeah.
And they'd be like the Scottish Socialist Party or something.
Yeah.
I
Without
think
him,
that's probably how they are going to be seen now.
Well, I
because
think
he's
so,
not
yeah,
there.
because he was their USP in some ways. We are the party of Alex Salmond. And yes, his poll ratings might have been low, but those that did still rate him really rated him, and kind of clung to that, the dream will never die kind of idea. It became almost the refuge for the cranks and the conspiracy theorists of the kind of nationalist cause.
Yeah.
I think there might, John Swinney right now might be sitting there thinking, no, thank God for the Alba Party, because it's probably it's got rid of dozens of potential problems for him. Potentially problematic people, characters like Ash Regan, for example. I mean, she's not going to be back at Holyrood now. She's pretty much destroyed her political career. We've seen what happened to Neil Hanvey and Kenny McCaskill. People didn't vote. I mean, Alba have never won an election, a vote of any kind in Scotland. Never. So it baffles me for people to think that they're going to start now without Alex Salmond.
I don't think Alex Salmond's last 5, 7, 9 years were his best. But, I mean, what a politician he was. I mean, changed Scotland. That referendum he managed to negotiate, regardless of your views on the constitutional question. He did manage to secure that.
Yeah.
I mean, Scotland in 2024, in a political context, is largely down to him.
Well, in part, yeah. But I would say as well, he is probably going to continue to have an impact on Scottish politics for quite some time to come. If you read the Sunday Mail at the weekend, there, I think there's obviously more to come in terms of legal things, and so he's the ghost of Alex Salmond is going to continue to haunt us for a long time.
I can't wait. Okay, let's sum up then. Politician of the year. Who's your pick?
Well, we at the Express put our
Drum roll.
put our heads together.
Let me guess. Could this be? Okay, I'll let you say it.
Okay, it is Russell Finlay, Scottish Conservative, still relatively new Scottish.
Is that because he's keeping the legacy of Liz Truss going? Is that?
Oh, shut up about that.
I was just saying.
You love that.
Yeah, people aren't allowed to change their minds, you know.
Well,
That's the only thing I know
I'm just
about him in a
fed up with
political
him talking
context.
about it.
But I think what he's doing so far, and the Tories are in for a rough ride in 2026, I think, regardless. Even though Reform are taking votes across the spectrum, they're obviously taking more votes from the Tories. But I think what Russell's come in and done is this idea of really focusing on everyday matters and things, issues that impact the person on the street. Holyrood's become a real talking shop where people seem to pick up on issues just to make themselves feel better. So much time is taken up on issues that aren't devolved, and stuff that Holyrood has no power over.
Yeah.
And I think his focus in trying to get Holyrood back to that, and take on that cosy left-wing agenda.
Taking
taking
up the cudgels on asylum seeker bus passes and funding for Malawi. I mean, it's these are massive dog whistles for reform. I mean, it is a lurch to the right.
No,
I think
that's nonsense.
Funding for Malawi's been there since Jack McConnell's day, and to single that out, and also for bus passes for like some of the most vulnerable people in society. Contrasting that with the winter fuel payment, I think it's scuzzy, low, horrible politics.
Right, so he's not your favourite
he's
person
not
then?
my politician of the year.
I think
Just person of the year, or person in general, by the sounds of
Time
it?
person of the year.
I think though that will play well with a section of the population. I've said before.
I've got no doubt, but I still think it's
Scotland
horrible.
has got loads of kind of quiet conservatives with a small c, who probably don't see anyone at Holyrood. Even when Douglas Ross was in charge, I think the Tories could be guilty of getting embroiled in that kind of talking shop mentality. Of, get involved in things that taking so much time on these kind of fringe issues, and I think it will play well with voters in parts of the country. Whether it's enough to turn it around for 2026, that's very ambitious.
Before Paul starts freaking out, we spent so long talking about Russell Finlay.
Listen, I'm always happy to talk about.
Anyway, my politician of the year, I am still here,
On you
is Fergus Ewing. What would you like to say about it?
This conversation's taken a shift to the right, but please, the floor's all yours.
So, I mean, it's not that I probably have, 0.0001% of things in common with Fergus Ewing, but
He takes your calls, and you're going to give him Politician of the Year award.
Sure. No, I have chosen Fergus because I am a huge fan of, and it comes from my time in Westminster, where I was seeing backbench politicians all the time, criticising their own party and holding their own party to account. And it's something I noticed that just does not happen enough in Holyrood. I think that everyone kind of goes with the same, along the same lines. Even if people disagree, they won't say that they disagree. And I think that, to be honest, it's been a breath of fresh air to see somebody like Fergus actually just say, do you know what, enough, I don't agree with this. And I think, you know, credit should be given to people who are willing to stand up for their principles and what they believe in. And I think he has actually quite successfully done that in Holyrood.
I agree that you need backbenchers who speak out against their own government, who focus on their constituents,
Yeah.
rather than just towing the line. And I think Fergus has been very good at that.
Yeah.
You know, it would be... Is he going to stand again? I don't know. I mean...
I think he might.
Yeah.
He's got nothing else to do, so... No, I think he might, but yeah, that's kind of why I have picked him as my politician of the year.
Okay, so Hannah's picked Fergus as source of the year.
And who's centrist dad picked? Who's centrist dad?
Centrist dad is going for... I mean...
Who will it be?
You know, if it was July the 4th, it would be Anas Sarwar, but I think that mid-December, I think John Swinney edges it.
Oh, wow.
Because he inherited a nightmare. Everyone thought he was going to stand down ahead of 2026. I think he jokes that the last year was his gap year or his sabbatical. He has steadied the ship. It was a much better budget than Humza delivered. He's united his group. His party is more united than it was. Obviously, we've got Operation Branchform still unresolved.
Just
That bomb could go off at any time.
Yeah.
But I just think he's put his party back on the pitch. He's given the SNP a chance of winning the Holyrood election. And
he's given you lots of splashes, so...
well, I mean, that allegedly. So
Yeah.
if that is the case, I would like more. That would be good.
If that happens to be the case...
But I think the Holyrood election is going to be very close.
Ignore Paul.
You know, if Anas is listening, obviously you're a Daily Record columnist, and you should also come to your favourite newspaper.
Which is the Sunday Mail.
Well,
Don't worry, Paul still loves you.
so I think that pretty much wraps it up. That's the last one this year. Merry Christmas, Happy New Year to all of our viewers. I hope you have a good one, and please join us again when the show resumes early next year.
We will never turn our back on a single Scot.
We've got to wrestle with those challenges.
This is our country. Let's fix it together.
It's the same nonsense we've heard time and time again.